Iron County, Michigan, September 1912. The air, already carrying the sharp promise of winter, smelled of pine resin and damp earth. On the south-facing slope of a low, glacially smoothed hill, a man was doing something no one in the cutover had ever seen. He was not felling trees for a cabin, he was digging one. Aatu Lehtonen moved with a methodical rhythm, his spade slicing into the sandy loam. Behind him, a rectangular wound grew in the hillside, a precise 16 by 20-foot cavity, already 6 feet deep at its northern edge. The excavated dirt formed a growing berm around the southern perimeter. He was a quiet man, broad in the shoulders, from a life of labor, his movements economical and sure. Down on the rough track that served as a road, wagons would slow, men would stop their work. Wilford Bradstreet, the Iron County land assessor, reined in his horse one afternoon, a leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm. He was a man whose world was ordered by plats, deeds, and the rigid definitions of the Homestead Act of 1862. He watched Aatu for a long moment, a frown deepening on his face. "What in God's name is that Finn doing?" he asked Silas Croft, a timberman whose own cabin stood a quarter-mile away, a proud, drafty box of notched logs. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice. "He's been at it for a week, Mr. Bradstreet. Digging. Says he's building his house. Looks more like he's digging a grave for his whole family before the snow flies." Another neighbor, Jedediah Morse, leaned on his axe handle, called it a savupirtti or some such. Told me it was a house. I told him it was a root cellar. A man can't live in a hole in the ground. It's foolishness. Plain foolishness. The word spread through the small, scattered community of miners, loggers, and homesteaders. The new Finn, the quiet one, was digging his family's home straight into the dirt. Mockery followed, first as quiet murmurs, then as open laughter. Children pointed. Men made jokes about him raising groundhogs instead of children. Aatu Lehtonen, they all agreed, was a fool. He was building a burrow, a den, a damp and miserable pit that would surely sicken his wife and 2 small children before Christmas. They saw a man digging. They didn't see the centuries of knowledge guiding his spade. What did this Finnish builder, a man who carried the traditions of Kainu in his bones, understand about the physics of an earth-coupled envelope that the experienced, practical men of the American frontier had missed entirely? What secret was held in the 45-degree soil that could defeat a 40-below winter? The story of Aatu Lehtonen isn't just about a strange cabin. It's a story about a different kind of wisdom and the profound power of working with nature, not against it. It's a lesson that would be written not in ink, but in warmth, survival, and a shockingly small woodpile. I promise you, by the end of this story, you will understand a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that could change how you see the very ground beneath your feet. If you find this kind of practical, historical ingenuity fascinating, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. And tell us in the comments, what's the most unconventional but effective solution you've ever seen someone build? Aatu Lehtonen was not a logger, though he could swing an axe with deadly precision. He was not a miner, though he knew the feel of rock and the weight of the earth. He was a builder, but his trade was alien to the pine forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. In his homeland of Kainu, a rugged region of eastern Finland, he had built savupirtti, smoke cottages. These were not the log cabins of American lore, standing proud and separate from the land. They were structures of earth and wood, nestled into hillsides, their turf roofs becoming part of the landscape itself. His hands knew the heft of sod blocks, the texture of birch bark used for waterproofing, the precise angle to dig into a slope to capture the low winter sun. He had come to America with his wife, Elena, and their 2 children, Pekka and Sophia, drawn by the promise of land and the letters from other Finns who spoke of work in the mines and forests. They had saved for years, and the 160-acre parcel in Iron County was their dream. But their first winter, 1911, had nearly broken them. They spent it in a hastily built conventional log cabin, a single-room structure considered standard for new settlers. It was a prison of cold. That winter, the cold was a physical entity. It had a presence, a weight. Aatu remembered the morning the cast-iron handle of their water pump, a tool of solid metal, bent at the wrist on his first pull, the iron made brittle as glass by the night's freeze. He remembered trying to make an entry in their modest account book, a record of expenses and earnings, only to find the ink in the bottle had frozen solid, the nib of his pen scratching uselessly against the page. The image that haunted him most, however, was of his son Pekka's small wool cap. Left on a peg in the unheated shed, it had become so stiff with frozen moisture that when Alina lifted it down, it cracked like a dry leaf. They survived, but only just. They huddled together, sleeping in their coats under a mountain of blankets. The walls were coated in a permanent layer of frost, sparkling cruelly in the meager light. Aatu spent every waking hour that wasn't at the lumber camp feeding the small, ravenous stove. He cut and hauled and split wood endlessly, yet the heat seemed to vanish the moment it left the firebox, sucked out through the 1,000 tiny gaps in the chinking, and conducted directly through the solid log walls. The cabin didn't hold warmth, it merely processed it, demanding a constant, exhausting tribute of fuel. By March, their woodpile was gone, and he was forced to trade precious savings for overpriced cordwood from an opportunistic neighbor. That spring, as the ground thawed, Aatu Lehtonen made a vow. He would not fight the next winter. He would partner with the earth to ignore it. To understand the genius of what Aatu was building, you must first understand the spectacular failure of what he was replacing. The conventional frontier log cabin, an icon of American self-reliance, was a thermal catastrophe. Its failure was not one of character, but of physics. The primary problem was exposure. A standard cabin, like the one Jedediah Morse built, stood alone, exposed on all four sides to the biting wind and brutal cold. Imagine a 16 by 20-foot structure. With 8-foot walls, that's a total of 720 square feet of wall surface, plus the roof, all bleeding heat, into an environment that could plummet to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. The logs themselves, typically 8 to 10 inches thick, offered some insulation, but not nearly enough. A solid pine log has an R value of about 1.25 per inch. An 8-inch wall, therefore, had an R value of around R10. By modern standards, that's less than a cheap patio door. Heat moves in three ways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The standard cabin was a masterclass in failing at all three. Conduction was the heat physically passing through the solid log walls, from the 60-degree interior to the minus 30-degree exterior. Convection was the air itself carrying the heat away. Cold air would knife through every crack in the chinking, the mud, moss, and clay packed between the logs. This created relentless drafts. As the warm interior air rose, it would escape through the roof and the upper parts of the wall, pulling more frigid air in from below. You could light a candle and watch the flame bend sideways, a silent testament to the river of cold air flowing through your living space. Finally, radiation meant that any object in the room, including the people, was constantly radiating its own heat toward the cold surfaces of the walls. Sitting near a wall in a log cabin felt like sitting next to an open refrigerator. The result was a heating load of monstrous proportions. To keep a cabin of that size even remotely habitable required a constant, massive fire. Engineers would later calculate that a structure of that type, in those conditions, would need to generate over 42,000 BTUs per hour just to fight off the cold. A single cord of seasoned hardwood contains about 24 million BTUs. This meant a family might burn through a cord of wood every 24 days of continuous, bitter cold, an astronomical amount of labor and resources. The men of Iron County weren't lazy. They were simply fighting a losing battle against thermodynamics. They were trying to heat the entire Upper Peninsula, one log at a time. Aatu Lehtonen watched his neighbors stack cords of wood 10 feet high and knew it was a fool's errand. The problem wasn't the stove. The problem wasn't the wood. The problem was the envelope, the skin of the house. He knew he couldn't change the winter, but he could drastically reduce the surface area that had to fight it. The construction began in earnest as the autumn colors peaked. The mockery from his neighbors did not cease. It intensified. They saw him not as a builder, but as an excavator. He used a heavy grub hoe and a railroad spade, tools of earth, not wood. He sharpened the spade's edge with a file until it could shear through the thick roots of blueberry and fern that laced the topsoil. The digging was slow, powerful work. Pekka and Sophia, aged 7 and 5, helped by carrying smaller rocks away in a woven basket, their faces smudged with dirt. Alina managed the household in their temporary shelter, a canvas tent reinforced with pine boughs. Her expression a mixture of quiet trust in her husband and palpable anxiety about the approaching cold. "He'll hit bedrock or a spring," Jedediah Morse prophesied to a group at the small general store. Then what? Live in a muddy hole? Aatu did not hit bedrock. He had chosen his site with care, walking the hills for days after the thaw, reading the landscape like a text. He selected a south-facing slope composed of deep, well-drained glacial till, a mix of sand, gravel, and clay. He dug until the back wall of the excavation was a sheer 6-foot face of compacted earth. The east and west walls tapered down from 6 feet at the back to ground level at the front. Next came the wood. He felled 8-inch diameter cedar logs for the rafters, laying them from the top of the earthen back wall to a heavy timber lintel that would frame the front southern-facing wall. This was the only part that resembled a traditional cabin. He meticulously notched the logs for the south wall and a single doorway, but the east, west, and north walls of his home were simply the raw, stable earth of the hillside. Wilford Bradstreet made his official visit in mid-October. He rode up the slope, dismounted, and walked to the edge of the pit, his polished boots incongruous against the raw dirt. He held a clipboard. Aatu was on his knees, peeling long, pliant strips of bark from a pile of white birch logs. Bradstreet cleared his throat. "Lehtonen," he began, his voice laced with bureaucratic certainty. "I am the county land assessor. I've had reports about your structure." Aatu looked up, his face impassive. He nodded once. "Under the Homestead Act of 1862, Bradstreet continued, his gaze sweeping over the whole, "a claimant must erect a dwelling on the parcel. The statutes are quite clear. A dwelling is a house. It has walls, a roof. It is a structure upon the land." He paused for effect. "What you are building, sir, is a burrow. It is a cellar. 3/4 of it is a hole in the ground. I have submitted a report to the land office in Iron Mountain. They concur. This does not satisfy the requirements of the Act. I am informing you that your claim is in jeopardy. If a proper dwelling is not erected, you will lose title to this parcel come April." The threat was immense. It wasn't just mockery anymore. It was the potential loss of everything they had worked for. Silas Croft, who had followed Bradstreet up the hill, watched with a grimly satisfied look. Aatu Lehtonen slowly stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at Bradstreet, then at the hole, then back at the assessor. The silence stretched. Bradstreet expected an argument, a plea, a burst of anger. Instead, Aatu said 2 words, his Finnish accent softening the edges. "Is warm." Then he turned, knelt, and went back to peeling his birch bark. Bradstreet was flummoxed by the man's quiet defiance. He shook his head, made a note on his clipboard, and rode away, convinced he was dealing with a stubborn, ignorant peasant. Aatu finished the roof next. Over the cedar rafters, he laid a tight, overlapping layer of the birch bark, creating a waterproof membrane that would last for decades. Then came the most crucial part. He and Alina, using ropes and a wooden ramp, began hauling the excavated sod and soil back up onto the roof. They packed it down, a dense layer of earth nearly a foot thick. By the time they were done, the roof was a living part of the hillside. Next spring it would green over with grass and wildflowers. The north, east, and west walls were then backfilled, the dirt tamped down firmly against the log structure, until the cabin was swallowed by the hill. Only the 16-foot-wide, 8-foot-high south wall remained exposed to the air, with its single sturdy door and 2 small double-paned windows Aatu had purchased at great expense. Inside he built a small hearth and chimney near the front of the cabin, a design that kept the smoke away from the living area but allowed the radiant heat from the masonry to warm the space. The physics Aatu understood were not complex, but they were profound. The ground beneath the frost line, even in the brutal Upper Peninsula winter, maintains a remarkably stable temperature. 6 feet down, the earth is a constant 45 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a massive natural thermal battery. For his neighbors in their conventional cabins, all 720 square feet of their walls were in a constant battle with air that was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature difference, or delta T, was a staggering 90 degrees, from 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit outside. This massive temperature gradient was a powerful engine of heat loss. Aatu's design fundamentally changed this equation. 3 of his walls, the north, east, and west, were not touching minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit air. They were pressed against 45 degrees Fahrenheit earth. The delta T for 3/4 of his home's envelope was not 90 degrees, but a mere 15 degrees, from 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside to 45 degrees Fahrenheit in the earth. This tiny difference meant heat loss through those walls slowed to a crawl. The earth wasn't just a wall, it was insulation. It was a thermal reservoir that was actively helping him, holding his home at a baseline of 45 degrees before he even lit a fire. The only part of his cabin fighting the winter was the south-facing wall. Its surface area was just 16 feet by 8 feet, or 128 square feet, plus another 120 square feet for the roof, which was heavily insulated by a foot of sod and soil. Instead of 720 square feet of wall, losing heat to the brutal cold, he had only about 240 square feet of total exposed surface. He had, in effect, eliminated 65 to 75% of his home's heat loss simply by burying it. The numbers were stark. The heating load, the BTUs per hour required to maintain a comfortable temperature, plummeted. Where his neighbors' cabins demanded over 42,000 BTUs per hour, Aatu's earth-sheltered savupirtti required only about 15,000. This was a 65% reduction. It meant he would need 65% less firewood. It was the difference between survival and a life of ceaseless, exhausting toil. The hillside wasn't just a location. It was the most important component of his home. The cold arrived in the second week of December, a vanguard of the true winter to come. But it was in early January that the polar blast descended. For 12 consecutive days, the temperature in Iron County did not rise above 20 degrees below zero. At night, it plunged to minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless 20-mile-per-hour north wind scoured the cutover, driving lake-effect snow from Lake Superior into monumental drifts. The cedar boughs were draped in thick, crystalline hoarfrost. It was the kind of cold that found every weakness. In the cabins of Aatu's neighbors, life ground to a halt. It became a singular battle for warmth. Men spent their days felling and hauling wood, their breath freezing in clouds before their faces. Inside, families lived in a small radius around their stoves. Water barrels froze solid. Ink froze. Food left more than a few feet from the fire froze. The walls groaned and popped in the cold, and drafts snaked across the floor, chilling ankles and stealing warmth. They were burning through their wood piles at a terrifying rate. Inside the Lehtonens' Hillside home, a different reality unfolded. The air was still. There were no drafts. The single south-facing wall was cold to the touch, and a faint tracery of frost sometimes appeared on the window panes. But the earthen walls were cool, not cold. They felt like the wall of a cellar in summer. The small stove glowed with a modest fire, Aatu adding a log not every 20 minutes, but every hour or two. The warmth it produced stayed. It settled in the small space like water in a bowl. The domestic warmth was proven not by a thermometer, but by the quiet hum of normal life. Elena sat at the small wooden table, her fingers nimble and sure as she mended a tear in Pekka's trousers with fine thread, a task that would have been impossible with stiff, cold hands. On a small shelf carved directly into the western earth wall, a dozen eggs sat in a bowl, entirely liquid. In any other home, they would have been frozen solid in hours. This was the most telling detail. The deep, stable warmth of the earth itself was keeping the far corners of the home above freezing. They were not just surviving, they were living. On the 10th day of the polar blast, Wilfred Bradstreet set out on his tax circuit. His duties included serving official notices, and in his satchel was the final eviction warning for Aatu Lehtonen, to be posted on the Finn's door. The April deadline was absolute. Bradstreet was not a cruel man, but he was a man of rules, and the rule said, Lehtonen's hole in the ground was not a house. The cold was vicious. Bradstreet was bundled in wool and buffalo hide, but the wind seemed to pierce it all. The runners of his sled hissed over the dry, wind-scoured snow. As he turned up the track toward Lehtonen's claim, the world was a stark composition of white and the dark green of pine. The cold had made everything brittle. As his sled passed over a hidden frozen root, there was a sharp crack, like a rifle shot. The right runner had split clean through. The sled lurched and tipped, and Bradstreet was thrown into a snowdrift. He was a mile from the nearest neighbor, save one. Cursing, shivering, he knew he had no choice. He had to seek shelter at the very home he was there to condemn. He floundered through the waist-deep snow, the wind tearing at him, his lungs aching with every breath. He finally reached the small clearing in front of Aatu's south wall. It looked absurd. A single wooden wall stuck in a giant snowdrift. Smoke curled lazily from the small chimney pipe. There was no desperate plume of a roaring fire, just a gentle wisp. He expected to find a scene of misery inside, a family huddled in squalor, freezing in a damp, smoky pit. He steeled himself for the blast of cold air that would meet him when the door opened. He raised a gloved hand and knocked. The door was opened by Aatu himself, who was wearing simple wool trousers and a thin cotton shirt. Bradstreet stared. Behind Aatu, his daughter Sophia sat on the floor, playing with a small wooden doll. She was in her shirt sleeves. The Vindication was not a shout. It was a wave of silent, still warmth. Bradstreet had expected to feel a gust of cold, smoky air rush out, the way it did from every other cabin. Instead, he was met by a gentle pressure of warm, dry, sweet-smelling air. It was the scent of baked bread, cedar, and clean wool. He stepped inside, his body instantly registering the profound difference. The cold, aching tension in his shoulders began to dissolve. His face, numb from the wind, began to prickle as it thawed. He looked around the single, cozy room. Elena was at the table, grinding barley in a small stone mill. The small stove gave off a pleasant, steady heat. But what caught his assessor's eye was the woodpile. Next to the stove was not a massive stack of logs, but a modest box, perhaps a quarter of a cord. For 10 days of this brutal cold, it was an impossibly small amount. "My sled," Bradstreet stammered, his voice thick. "The runner," it cracked. "I see," Aatu said calmly. "Sit. Alina, coffee." As Bradstreet sat, stripping off his frozen gloves, his eyes scanned the interior. He saw the smooth, cool, earthen walls. He ran a bare hand over the eastern wall. It wasn't icy. It felt like cool stone. He was experiencing the 15-degree delta T with his own palm. This was not a wall fighting winter. This was a wall at peace with the earth. Then he saw it. On a small shelf set into the northern earth wall, the deepest part of the home, sat a covered ceramic crock. "What is that?" Bradstreet asked, gesturing. "Talkuna," Aatu said. "Barley porridge. Alina made it for Lopiainen." Lopiainen? The epiphany. That was 6 days ago. Porridge, left for 6 days in any other cabin in Iron County, would be a frozen rock. Every neighbor's oat porridge had frozen in the pot on the stove if the fire died down for an hour. Aatu walked over, took the lid off the crock, and dipped a wooden spoon inside. He held it out to Bradstreet. The porridge was thick, viscous, and faintly steaming. It was still warm. Not hot, but warm. The immense thermal mass of the hillside, holding its 45-degree temperature, had kept food from freezing for nearly a week, a feat that seemed less like construction and more like magic. That spoonful of warm porridge was the ultimate proof. It was a sensory detail that shattered Bradstreet's entire understanding of what a house was. He looked from the porridge to the small woodpile to the children playing comfortably on the floor. He looked at the calm, quiet Finn who had built it all. In that moment, Wilford Bradstreet, the county assessor, the man of rules and regulations, became Aatu Lehtonen's first convert. He took a sip of the hot, strong coffee Alina offered him and felt the warmth spread through his chest. He looked at Aatu, his expression one of dawning, profound respect. "You didn't build a cabin, Lehtonen," Bradstreet said, his voice quiet with awe. "You built a harbor in the earth." Bradstreet stayed for 2 hours while Aatu expertly repaired the sled runner with wire and heated pitch. When he left, the eviction notice was still in his satchel. He did not post it. The next week, he rode to the land office in Iron Mountain. He didn't just withdraw his report, he became Aatu's fiercest advocate. He argued that the Homestead Act was intended to promote settlement and survival, and that Lehtonen's structure, while unconventional, fulfilled that purpose more brilliantly than any standard cabin he had ever assessed. He described the warm interior, the tiny woodpile, the porridge that refused to freeze. He called it a new and superior form of dwelling for this climate. The objection was officially struck from the record. Aatu Lehtonen's title was secure. News of the Finns' dirt house that stayed warm all winter spread, but now the tone was one of wonder, not mockery. The story reached Hancock, home of Suomi College, a center of Finnish-American culture and learning. In March 1913, the college's bulletin published a short article titled "A Kainu Solution for a Michigan Winter." It featured a detailed cross-section diagram of Aatu's savupirtti, drawn by Bradstreet himself, complete with dimensions and notes on the sod roof and earth-bermed walls. The article electrified the Finnish farming communities scattered across the Upper Peninsula. These were people who understood the crushing labor of a northern winter. They read the article not as a curiosity, but as a blueprint for a better life. That spring and summer, a quiet revolution began. By the autumn of 1913, 7 other Finnish families across Iron and Baraga counties had built their own versions of the Hillside dugout. The technique spread not through official channels, but through community, validated by the simple, undeniable proof that it worked. They saved firewood, they saved labor, and their families lived in a level of comfort their neighbors could only dream of. The principles Aatu Lehtonen employed in 1912 were not new, but they were revolutionary for their time and place. He was practicing what we would today call sustainable, passive design. His earth-coupled home was a forerunner of the modern earth-sheltered and geothermal-assisted buildings that are now at the cutting edge of energy efficiency. By using the immense thermal mass of the planet as a heat sink in summer and a heat source in winter, he anticipated by more than half a century the core tenets of green architecture. He demonstrated that the most powerful technology is often a deeper understanding of the natural systems we live within. The story of the quiet Finn who dug his house into a hill became a local legend. But its true meaning is quieter and more profound. In a world that often prizes aggressive force and fighting against the elements, Aatu Lehtonen chose a different path. He looked at the brutal Michigan winter and did not see an enemy to be conquered with a bigger fire. He saw a system to be understood. He didn't build a fortress against the cold. He simply asked the hillside to hold 3 of his walls warm, while one small stove took care of the last. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest ingenuity lies not in what we add, but in what we subtract. In this case, subtracting the need to fight a battle that can never truly be won. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you believe this kind of practical wisdom deserves to be remembered, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of forgotten ingenuity. Let us know in the comments, what other historical building techniques do you think we should explore? We appreciate your support, which allows us to continue bringing these incredible stories to light. Disclaimer: the information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, based on real historical practices and principles. The characters and specific events are fictionalized for narrative effect. Any application of these or similar techniques today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and engineering best practices. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.